Hi, this is Eric Keller for Otoy. In this project, we're going to take a look at some techniques you can use to make your foliage look a little bit more realistic in your scenes rendered using Octane. And this project is done in Maya 2016 with Octane version 3. And you can see we have these nice translucent materials applied to the leaves of the ivy as well as the petals of the flower here. And it's allowing shadows cast from one side of the surface to come through to the other side of the surface. So it's giving this sort of it looks particularly nice in backlighting situations. So if I zoom in here, you can see what I mean. We have the shadow cast here on the leaf, and you can see that it's coming through. And the same thing for the flower petals. You can also see in some of the other renders how I'm using two different materials on the leaf geometry. And so on one side we have a shiny version of the material and a texture for the top of the ivy leaf. And the other side we have a less glossy and a different texture with slightly different value to it. And this is also useful for increasing realism as well as a sense of three-dimensionality or depth into the plants, because we have this nice variation in color. Of course, I am using the exact same leaf texture for every single leaf on the ivy plant, and the flowers are all duplicates. So that kind of betrays the realism a little bit, but mostly what we're interested in this particular project is how to set up the materials. So let's start by taking a look at the material that I've applied to the flower petals in the scene to create this translucent effect. If I switch over to Photoshop, here's a diagram of the actual material. It's a very straightforward mixed material setup. A mixed material blends two different other types of Octane materials together depending on a particular amount between 0 and 1. So a value of 1 is 100% of one material, or a value of 0 is 100% of the other material, and a value of 0.5 is a 50-50 blend between the two materials. Now I'm using a diffuse and a specular material to create the translucency effect. The diffuse is providing much of the color, and the spec is providing much of the translucency. Now there's lots of different ways you can create translucency within Octane for Maya. You can use an absorption node or a scattering node or a volume medium. The problem is the way that I have my flowers set up. If you take a look at the geometry in the Maya scene, I'm using a two-dimensional surface for the flower petals. So you can see this has no thickness to it. And in order for the scattering mediums or the other types of mediums to work, you need to have some thickness. So as kind of an alternative method, what I'm doing is, instead of using an absorption medium or a scattering medium, I'm using a specular material with the index set to a value of 1, with a color, a very light color, applied to the transmission channel, and I'm also increasing the roughness. And by increasing the roughness, it's essentially blurring out the transparency on the surface. And if I set it way up high, it's almost like, it's kind of like frosted glass in a way. So it's a bit of a cheat, but it works pretty well for this purpose. So in Maya 2016, I'm going to open up the Hypershade. So here's the mixed material, and you can see I have flower diffuse in material slot 1 and flower spec in material slot 2. And the amount slider I can use to dial up or down the amount of translucency. So if we take a look at the flower diffuse, it's very, very simple. It is a diffuse material, and I have an image texture that is applied to the diffuse channel. Here's what that diffuse texture looks like. So kind of a very simple flower-like texture that I painted, poly painted in ZBrush. So we have that, and we also have a bump map, and this is what the bump map looks like. So it's really kind of like a modified displacement map that I created from ZBrush. So just a bump and a diffuse plugged into the diffuse shader, and I've played with the roughness a little bit. Higher roughness for a diffuse material is going to give you kind of a velvety quality in a way. So I was just kind of playing with these values and experimenting to see what I like. These aren't any particular specific values, they're just part of experimentation. And that's it for the diffuse material. If we go down to the specular material, you can see that I have the same texture map, image texture, is going into the transmission of the specular material. So we have the same image texture, this is the flower color, that's being plugged into the transmission of the specular material. And this image texture is very light in color. It's mostly white with a little bit of green for the stem and some yellow and some slight discoloration. But since it's such a light color, it's very similar to adding an amount, a very high amount for the transmission, which is going to make the flower petals essentially transparent. I've set the index of refraction, to a value of 1 so that there's no refraction. I've also used the same bump texture, it's a float image texture, for the bump of the specular material. And then I've increased the roughness almost to 100%. So play with this slider a little bit to sort of change the translucent quality of the surface. The one other thing I wanted to point out about this material is that I found that I get a better looking translucent effect if I select my specular material and turn on fake shadows. So now let's take a look at the leaf, which is slightly more complex. So I'm going to hide this diagram here. Let's take a look at the leaf diagram. So the leaf diagram has two mixed materials that are kind of nested. So I have the main mixed material that's applied to the leaf geometry, and I have a specular material that, very much like the flower, is providing us with a nice sort of translucency. Instead of just using the amount slider, I'm using a float image map, but it's a nice way to kind of control, or at least show some detail in the translucency. Now in this mixed material, rather than just having a glossy material, I have another mixed material. And the purpose of this mixed material is to allow me to apply two different materials on either side of the leaf. Because just like the flower, if we take a look at the leaf geometry, it is really simple. It's just polygon squares. This was originally a paint effects brush that was just converted into polygons. But you could use this technique for any type of plant that has polygon squares for leaves. And if you take a look at the UVs, they're very simple, just a square. I have one material for the top of the leaf, another material for the bottom of the leaf. Both are glossy, but they have different roughness settings. And I'm using the polygon side texture as the input of this mixed material. So this one handles applying two different materials on either side of the leaf. This is plugged into another mixed material. This spec handles the translucency. A float image map is controlling the amount or the blending between these two materials, and that is applied to the leaf geometry. So let's take a look at a graph of the material applied to the leaves in the hypershade. And we can see that the top material is called Octane Ivy Mix. That's the one that's actually applied to the leaf surfaces. In the amount slider, I have an image texture, a float image texture. If you take a look at it, here we can see it's a grayscale image. We have kind of brings out some of the veins. So that image texture is plugged into, take a look at it, it's plugged into amount right here. And you can control the brightness of that image, which would then control the mixing of the two other materials by controlling the power. So in other words, bringing the power down is going to make this image darker, which is going to bias towards one material as opposed to the other. Now if we take a look at the two materials, let's take a look at the specular material. It's very simple. Specular material, green color plugged into the transmission, which is then plugged into material 2 of the Octane mix, Ivy mix. In the opacity channel of this specular material, I have a simple mask, which is providing that leaf shape. So the opacity controls kind of a cutout if you wanted to create a leaf from a simple flat polygon. And then for the other settings in the spec material, index is set to 1, and I don't have anything in the bump channel, and I have fake shadows turns on, which tends to make it makes the shadows cast on the opposite side of the leaf. These shadows right here that you can see through the translucent side. It makes them look a little bit better, and it also makes it render a little bit faster, I think. And then I have roughness set all the way to 1, which is creating kind of that frosted glass translucent effect to it. So giving us a nice color in the backlighting. So if we take a look at the material in material slot 1 here, so spec is going into material 2, and what's going on to material 1 is another mixed material. So this is called leaf color mix. And for the amount on this mixed material, I'm using the Octane polygon side texture. You can find that in the Octane textures down here, polygon side. So what this does is the material is going to look at the normal direction of the surface that it's applied to, and based on that normal direction, it's going to apply one material to one side of the surface and another material to the other side of the surface. Let's take a look at the top material, which is a glossy material. So pretty straightforward here. I have, let's take a look at what's plugged into diffuse. It is a standard Octane image texture plugged into diffuse. If you take a look at it, it's simply a scan. of that ivy leaf. Now, usually I'll stick a color correct node in between the image texture and the glossy material. You'll see I've done that for some of the other textures. I didn't do it for this one, but putting a color correct texture in there would make it easier to kind of dial in up and down the brightness or the contrast of the image or whatever. So in the roughness channel for this top gloss material, I do have a color correct texture and I have a float image texture. So the float image texture is being connected to the texture input of the color correct texture, and then the out texture of the color correct texture is going into the roughness of this glossy material. So if I take a look at that image, it is essentially a color corrected version of that same leaf scan of the top of the ivy leaf. And as you'll notice that it's very dark, which means that it's going to be very shiny. And then I have kind of a standard bump map that's applied to the top, again based on that scan of that image. And for the bump, I've kind of lowered the power, which lowers the strength of the bump. But if you take a look, that's the bump image right there. And then the bottom gloss is really similar. The only difference is really the texture maps that I used. So for the bottom gloss, I did have an image texture. This is the bottom of the leaf. And I do have a color correct node that's allowing me to brighten up that image if I need to kind of make it a little bit more obvious in the scene that one side is brighter than the other. So that's the diffuse. I also have similar texture map, float image texture plugged into the bump. Again, very simply color corrected version of that scan to the bottom of the ivy leaf. And then I have way down here, let's bring it up to here, I have another float image texture, and that is applied to the roughness channel. So take a look. There you can see. Now, if you want to take a closer look at this setup, of course you can download the scene files and take a look at them in Maya 2016 and see what it looks like when you render it with Octane. But I think that gives you a good start to building some nice realistic looking leaves and flowers. Of course, you could also experiment, if these are instances of each other, you could experiment with using kind of a random color node to maybe create variation between copies of the flowers or copies of the leaves. That would also increase a little bit of visual interest, as well as using different texture maps or different mixed materials and different selected leaves in here, just to break up the kind of uniformity a little bit more. But again, just some ideas to get you started, and I hope this has been a helpful project.